When Elizabeth Hackman walked into the elegant five-star restaurant on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, she had no idea that her evening would turn into a social media phenomenon. The daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman was about to experience something that would not only change her perspective, but would send ripples through the entire restaurant industry. What happened next left patrons stunned, staff members scrambling, and ultimately revealed a side of the Hackman family that few had ever glimpsed before. Comment where you're watching from today, and let's dive into this remarkable story. The restaurant, Maison Laurent, was known for its exclusive atmosphere and celebrity clientele. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over white linen tablecloths, while the soft murmur of conversations and gentle classical music created an atmosphere of refined luxury. The establishment had earned its reputation not just for its impeccable French cuisine, but for being notoriously selective about its patrons. Reservations were often booked months in advance, and the unspoken dress code was understood by all who aspired to dine there. Elizabeth Hackman had inherited her father's understated demeanor and quiet confidence. At 42, she had deliberately stayed out of the spotlight that had followed her famous father throughout his celebrated acting career. She preferred the life she had built as a respected pediatric surgeon, letting her work speak for itself rather than her Hollywood connection. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple style, and she wore minimal makeup. Unlike many celebrity children, Elizabeth had no interest in flaunting her family name or seeking special treatment. That evening, Elizabeth had decided to treat herself after completing a grueling 36-hour shift at the hospital where she had successfully performed emergency surgery on a 5-year-old boy. She had saved his life, and though exhaustion tugged at her edges, there was a quiet satisfaction in knowing she had made a difference. She hadn't bothered to change out of her simple black pants and navy blue blouse, throwing on a light jacket before heading to the restaurant. Her reservation had been made weeks ago, a rare indulgence she allowed herself. As she approached the maitre d's podium, she noticed the immediate assessment in his gaze. Marcel Dupont had been the face of Maison Laurent for 15 years, and he prided himself on recognizing the city's elite. His eyes traveled from Elizabeth's sensible shoes to her minimal jewelry, making split-second judgments with each observation. "Good evening. I have a reservation under Hackman," Elizabeth said with a polite smile. Marcel's perfectly manicured finger scrolled down his tablet. "Hackman, for one person at 8 o'clock. "That's correct." Marcel's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "I see. And you are Elizabeth Hackman?" "Yes, that's right." The maitre d's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you happen to have any identification with you, madame?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow but reached for her wallet. "Of course." She handed over her driver's license, slightly puzzled by the request. It wasn't standard practice at restaurants to verify identity, but she thought perhaps it was a new security measure for such an exclusive establishment. Marcel examined the license with exaggerated care, then handed it back. "I'm terribly sorry, Ms. Hackman, but I'm afraid we won't be able to accommodate you this evening." The statement hung in the air between them, crisp and unexpected. "I'm sorry?" Elizabeth's voice remained level, though confusion crossed her features. "I made this reservation over a month ago." "Yes, well..." Marcel adjusted his tie, glancing around the restaurant where several diners had begun to take notice of the exchange. "We have certain standards at Maison Laurent. I'm afraid your current presentation does not meet our criteria this evening." Elizabeth followed his gaze to her simple attire. "I see." She didn't raise her voice or cause a scene. Years of working in high-pressure medical situations had taught her to remain composed even in the most unexpected circumstances. "Is there a specific dress code I wasn't informed about when I made the reservation?" Marcel's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Our clientele expect a certain ambiance. We reserve the right to maintain that atmosphere." What Marcel didn't say was that he had recently implemented an unofficial policy of turning away guests who didn't appear to belong to their usual wealthy demographic. Elizabeth's simple clothing and lack of designer accessories had triggered his judgment, and her unassuming demeanor hadn't suggested she was anyone of consequence. A few tables away, Sophia Reynolds, the restaurant's most regular patron and influential food blogger, watched the interaction with increasing interest. She recognized Elizabeth immediately, not because of her father's fame, but because Elizabeth had performed life-saving surgery on her nephew last year. The renowned surgeon who never mentioned her Hollywood lineage was being denied a table because she didn't look the part. Elizabeth considered her options. She could reveal her family name more explicitly, she could cause a scene, or she could simply leave. None of these appealed to her. Her father had taught her that true character showed in how you handled difficult situations, not in how you wielded privilege. "I understand," she said finally. "Thank you for your time." Marcel's relief was palpable. He had expected a different reaction, perhaps outrage or demands to speak to the manager. This calm acceptance was unsettling in its own way. "Perhaps another time," he offered insincerely. Elizabeth nodded and turned to leave. As she did, she caught the eye of Sophia Reynolds, who had half risen from her seat. Elizabeth gave her a small, genuine smile of recognition before continuing toward the door. Outside, the cool evening air greeted her. Elizabeth paused on the sidewalk, considering where to go next. Her stomach reminded her that she hadn't eaten since a hasty breakfast nearly 12 hours ago. She pulled out her phone, deciding to order something simple, and returned to her apartment. What she didn't realize was that inside the restaurant, things were about to take an unexpected turn. Sophia Reynolds had abandoned her table and approached Marcel with a forceful determination that made the maitre d' straighten his posture. "Marcel, do you have any idea who you just turned away?" Sophia's voice carried just enough to be heard by nearby tables. Marcel's confident expression faltered slightly. "A woman who didn't meet our dress code standards." Sophia's laugh was sharp and without humor. That was Dr. Elizabeth Hackman, one of the most brilliant pediatric surgeons in the country. She probably came straight from saving someone's child's life. And yes, she's also Gene Hackman's daughter, though she never uses that connection. The color drained from Marcel's face as murmurs spread through the nearby tables. In his attempt to curate the restaurant's image, he had made a devastating miscalculation. Meanwhile, Elizabeth had begun walking toward a small deli she knew stayed open late. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Sophia. "Please come back." What happened was unacceptable. Elizabeth paused, considering her response. She hadn't come to the restaurant for drama or special treatment. She had simply wanted a good meal in a quiet atmosphere. But something was forming in her mind, an idea born from years of witnessing inequality in various forms. This wasn't just about her being denied service. It was about a culture that judged people based on appearances rather than character. She texted back a simple message. "Thank you, but I have a better idea." What Elizabeth did next would not only shake the foundations of Maison Laurent, but would spark a movement that would ripple through the restaurant industry, challenging long-held assumptions about privilege, access, and the true meaning of service. Her response, measured but powerful, would demonstrate why the Hackman legacy was about far more than Hollywood fame. It would show that sometimes the most shocking response to disrespect isn't outrage. It's thoughtful, purposeful action that changes the conversation entirely. Elizabeth's phone continued to buzz with messages from Sophia, but her mind was already racing with possibilities. The small deli she had spotted was called Emilio's, a family-owned establishment that had somehow survived decades of Manhattan's ever-changing restaurant landscape. Unlike the polished exterior of Maison Laurent, Emilio's storefront was modest, with a simple neon sign and a menu posted in the window advertising homemade Italian specialties. When Elizabeth pushed open the door, she was greeted by the rich aroma of garlic, tomato sauce, and freshly baked bread. The interior was warm and inviting, with checkered tablecloths and photographs of Italy lining the walls. Despite the late hour, several tables were occupied by a diverse mix of people, students hunched over laptops, hospital workers still in scrubs, and neighborhood locals engaged in animated conversations. Behind the counter stood Emilio himself, a man in his 60s with salt and pepper hair and laugh lines etched deeply around his eyes. He looked up when Elizabeth entered and offered a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Welcome, welcome, dining alone tonight?" he asked, his accent still carrying traces of his Italian homeland. "Yes, just me," Elizabeth replied, immediately feeling the contrast between this greeting and her experience at Maison Laurent. "Perfect. Any table you like. Maria will bring you a menu." Emilio gestured to the open tables. Elizabeth chose a small corner table and settled in. the weight of her long day finally catching up with her. A young woman who resembled Emilio approached with a menu and a glass of water. "I'm Maria, Emilio's daughter. Can I get you something to drink while you look at the menu?" "Just water is fine, thank you." Elizabeth smiled gratefully. As Maria walked away, Elizabeth observed the restaurant more carefully. Unlike Maison Laurent, where each table seemed to exist in its own carefully constructed bubble of exclusivity, here, conversations flowed freely between tables. An elderly couple at the next table offered recommendations on the pasta dishes, while a group of medical residents, identifiable by their tired eyes and hospital IDs still clipped to their clothing, laughed over shared experiences from their shift. There was something about this place that resonated with Elizabeth. It wasn't just the warm welcome or the delicious aromas. It was the genuine sense of community that permeated the space. Everyone was treated with the same respect, regardless of their appearance or status. Elizabeth ordered the house specialty, a simple but perfect pasta pomodoro, and as she ate, she couldn't help comparing her current experience with what might have been at Maison Laurent. Here, the food was prepared with care rather than pretension, served with pride rather than ceremony. As she finished her meal, Emilio himself came to check on her. "How was everything?" "Good, I hope." "It was wonderful," Elizabeth replied honestly. "Actually, I have a question for you. Do you ever do special events?" Emilio's eyes lit up. "Sometimes. Birthday parties, small celebrations. Why do you ask?" Elizabeth considered her next words carefully. "I'm a surgeon at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital. We have an annual fundraiser coming up for our pediatric oncology department. I was thinking about potential catering options." Maria, who had overheard the conversation, joined them. "We've never done anything that formal before, but my brother Marco is actually a trained chef. He's been trying to convince Dad to expand our catering services." "We're a small operation," Emilio added, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Your hospital event sounds very prestigious." Elizabeth smiled warmly. "That's exactly why I'm interested. The food at these events is usually all presentation and no substance. What you serve here has heart. That's what our event should represent." The conversation continued, with Elizabeth explaining more about the hospital's work and the upcoming fundraiser. By the time she left Emilio's, she had not only enjoyed a satisfying meal, but had planted the seeds for something much larger than a catering arrangement. Meanwhile, back at Maison Laurent, the situation had evolved into a full-blown crisis. Sophia Reynolds had not only confronted Marcel, but had also posted about the incident on her widely followed social media accounts. Within hours, the story of how the daughter of Hollywood legend Gene Hackman, who was also one of the city's most respected pediatric surgeons, had been turned away because she didn't look exclusive enough after coming from saving a child's life, was trending online. The restaurant's owner, Laurent Bisset, a French restaurateur who had built his reputation on excellence and exclusivity, had been called in to manage the situation. He sat in his office, scrolling through the mounting negative comments with increasing alarm. "How could this happen, Marcel?" Laurent demanded, his accent thickening with stress. "Do you have any idea the damage this is causing?" Marcel shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, she didn't identify herself as Gene Hackman's daughter. She was wearing ordinary clothes, no jewelry. How was I to know?" Laurent slammed his hand on the desk. "That is precisely the problem. We don't turn away guests based on their appearance. She had a reservation. That should have been enough." "But you've always said we need to maintain our exclusive atmosphere," Marcel protested weakly. "Exclusive does not mean exclusionary." Laurent's face had turned an alarming shade of red. Excellence in service means treating everyone with respect. That is what built this restaurant's reputation, not turning away guests because they don't wear designer labels. As the crisis meeting continued at Maison Laurent, Elizabeth was returning to her apartment. She checked her phone to find it flooded with notifications, texts from friends who had seen Sophia's posts, emails from colleagues, and even a voicemail from her father. Gene Hackman, despite being largely retired from public life, remained protective of his family. His message was brief, but supportive. "Lizzie, heard about what happened. You okay? Call me. Love you." Elizabeth smiled at her father's concern. She had inherited his dignity and his belief in treating people based on their character rather than their status. She dialed his number, knowing he would appreciate her plan more than anyone. What Elizabeth had set in motion during her seemingly simple dinner at Emilio's wasn't just a response to one night's humiliation. It was the beginning of a movement that would challenge the very foundation of how restaurants viewed service and exclusivity. By morning, her idea would begin taking shape, bringing together unlikely allies from across New York's diverse culinary landscape. And it would all start with a phone call to her father, whose own experiences with fame and its pitfalls would provide the perfect perspective for what she planned to do next. By the following morning, Elizabeth's phone was ringing non-stop. News outlets had picked up the story, and what had begun as a social media post by Sophia Reynolds had evolved into a full-blown viral sensation. Elizabeth, however, wasn't interested in the spotlight. She had already called the hospital to request a rare day off, something she rarely did outside of absolute necessity. Her conversation with her father the previous night had solidified her resolve. Gene Hackman, despite his legendary status in Hollywood, had always maintained a grounded perspective on fame and privilege. "It's not about getting even, Lizzie," he had told her in his characteristic gravelly voice. "It's about making things right, not just for you, but for everyone who's been judged by appearances rather than character." Elizabeth sat at her kitchen table, making notes on a legal pad while sipping her morning coffee. Her plan was taking shape, inspired by her father's words and her experience at Emilio's. By mid-morning, she had made several calls, to Sophia Reynolds, to her hospital's community outreach coordinator, and most importantly, to Emilio and his son, Marco. Meanwhile, Maison Laurent was in damage control mode. Laurent Bisset had called an emergency meeting with his entire staff. The restaurant's phones had been ringing constantly with cancellations, and their social media accounts were flooded with negative comments. "This is a disaster," Laurent said, pacing the elegant dining room that now stood empty during what should have been a busy lunch service. "But it is also an opportunity for us to remember what true hospitality means." Marcel stood uncomfortably to the side, aware that all eyes were on him. His position as maître d' was now precarious at best. "I have made a decision," Laurent continued. "We will close for 3 days. When we reopen, it will be with a renewed commitment to service, real service, that welcomes all guests with reservations, regardless of their appearance or status." A murmur went through the staff. Closing for 3 days would cost the restaurant tens of thousands of dollars, but they understood the gravity of the situation. "And Marcel," Laurent added, turning to face his longtime maître d', "you will use this time to reflect on whether you can embrace this philosophy. If not, perhaps it is time for you to find another establishment more aligned with your views on exclusivity." Across town, Elizabeth was meeting with Emilio, Maria, and Marco in their deli, which was closed between lunch and dinner service. The small table was covered with papers, sketches of menu ideas, lists of potential participants, and budget considerations. "So let me understand," Emilio said, his expression a mixture of excitement and disbelief. "You want to organize a charity dinner here? At our little deli?" Elizabeth nodded. "Not just a dinner, but an event that brings together some of New York's most diverse culinary talents. Restaurants from every neighborhood, representing different cultures and price points, all collaborating on a single menu." "And the proceeds will go to your children's hospital?" Maria asked. "Yes, specifically to our program that provides support services to families of long-term pediatric patients," Elizabeth explained. "Many of these families struggle with basic needs while their children are in treatment. They need housing near the hospital, meal assistance, transportation." Marco, who had been quietly considering the proposal, finally spoke up. "But why involve Maison Laurent? After how they treated you?" Elizabeth's expression remained calm and determined. "Because this isn't about retribution. It's about transformation. True exclusivity shouldn't be about keeping people out. It should be about creating something so special that everyone wants to be included." The concept was ambitious, a one-night event where New York's culinary spectrum would converge. From Michelin-starred chefs to neighborhood favorites, each would contribute a dish representing their unique perspective, but served in the unpretentious setting of Emilio's deli. Tickets would be priced on a sliding scale, ensuring accessibility while still raising significant funds. As word of Elizabeth's initiative spread through New York's restaurant community, something unexpected happened. Chefs and restaurant owners began reaching out, eager to participate. Many had their own stories of experiencing or witnessing discrimination based on appearance, accent, or background. By late afternoon, Elizabeth received a call she hadn't anticipated. It was Laurent Bisset himself. "Dr. Hackman," he began, his French accent more pronounced than usual, suggesting his nervousness. "I heard about your charity event from several of my colleagues. I would like to offer Maison Laurent's participation, if you will have us." Elizabeth paused before responding. "Mr. Bisset, this event is about bringing people together across differences. It's about recognizing that excellence in food and service can exist at every price point and in every neighborhood." "I understand," Laurent replied, "and I believe Maison Laurent needs to learn this lesson more than anyone. What happened to you? It should never have occurred. I failed as a leader by allowing an atmosphere where such judgment could take place." Elizabeth considered his words. "Your participation would be welcome, Mr. Bisset, but on one condition. I'd like your chef to collaborate with Emilio and Marco on a dish that combines your restaurant's techniques with their traditional family recipes." The symbolism wasn't lost on Laurent. A fusion of haute cuisine and home cooking? It would be an honor. What Elizabeth had set in motion was rapidly evolving beyond a simple response to a personal slight. It was becoming a movement that challenged the very notion of what made a dining experience valuable. Was it the exclusivity and prices, or was it the authenticity and welcome extended to every guest? 3 days later, as Elizabeth met with the now extensive planning committee at Emilio's, the event had grown to include 20 restaurants from across the city. The media had caught wind of the initiative, dubbing it "Breaking Bread," and tickets were selling faster than they could be made available. What had begun as one woman's dignified response to being denied service had transformed into a celebration of New York's diverse culinary landscape and a powerful statement about inclusion. Gene Hackman, watching his daughter's vision unfold from a distance, couldn't have been prouder. Elizabeth had taken an insult and transformed it into an opportunity, not just for retribution, but for genuine community building. The event was scheduled for the following weekend, and as preparations intensified, Elizabeth found herself at the center of a movement that would change not just how restaurants viewed their guests, but how the city viewed its restaurants. The stage was set for a night that would indeed shock everyone, not with scandal or outrage, but with a powerful demonstration of how breaking bread together could break down the very barriers that divided people. The night of the Breaking Bread event arrived with an electricity in the air that transcended the usual buzz of New York City. Emilio's deli had been transformed. The checkered tablecloths remained, but now they were accented with elegant floral arrangements donated by a local florist. String lights crisscrossed the ceiling, and additional tables had been set up in the small courtyard behind the restaurant. The humble neighborhood spot now pulsed with anticipation and possibility. Elizabeth arrived early, dressed simply but elegantly in a black dress that would have been deemed appropriate even by Marcel's exacting standards. She watched as the participating chefs began to arrive, each bringing their signature dishes. What struck her most was the diversity, not just in the cuisines represented, but in the people themselves. Michelin-starred chefs in crisp whites worked alongside neighborhood cooks in casual attire, all united by their passion for food and community. Emilio greeted each arrival with the same warmth, whether they came from a famous establishment or a corner bodega known for its exceptional sandwiches. His son Marco coordinated the kitchen with surprising authority, his years of formal culinary training now serving a purpose greater than he had imagined. At precisely 7 o'clock, the first guests began to arrive. The ticketing system had been designed to ensure a true cross-section of the city. Some tickets had been sold at premium prices to benefit the hospital, while others had been distributed at reduced rates or even given to families currently being served by the pediatric programs. The result was a gathering that reflected New York's true diversity. Sophia Reynolds arrived with her camera crew, prepared to document the event for her widely followed blog. "Elizabeth, this is remarkable," she said, embracing the surgeon. "You've created something truly special here." Elizabeth smiled, watching as strangers became dining companions, sharing tables and stories as they sampled the eclectic menu. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about what happens when we value authenticity over exclusivity." An hour into the event, A hushed murmur spread through the crowd as Laurent Bisset arrived with his executive chef. Their contribution to the menu, a sophisticated take on Emilio's classic marinara sauce, served over handmade pasta, had been prepared in collaboration with Marco and represented a literal fusion of their culinary worlds. Laurent approached Elizabeth, extending his hand. "Doctor, Hackman, thank you for including us. The atmosphere here tonight, it is something we could learn from at Maison Laurent." Before Elizabeth could respond, the door opened once more, and a tall, distinguished figure entered. At 75, Gene Hackman still commanded attention, though he had largely retreated from public life in recent years. Conversations paused as recognition spread through the crowd. He made his way directly to his daughter, embracing her with evident pride. "You've done good, Lizzie," he said, his voice carrying just enough for those nearby to hear. "This is how you change things, not with anger, but with inclusion." The presence of the Hollywood legend added an unexpected dimension to the evening, but what impressed the attendees most was not his celebrity status, but the obvious bond between father and daughter. They watched as Gene Hackman moved through the crowd, engaging with everyone with the same genuine interest, whether they were hospital donors in designer clothes or parents of patients who had received assistance from the program this event was supporting. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth stepped onto a small platform that had been set up for announcements. The crowd quieted as she prepared to speak. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began. "What started as a simple denial of service has become something I never could have imagined. Tonight, we've raised over $200,000 for the family support program at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital." Applause erupted, and Elizabeth waited for it to subside before continuing. "But beyond the money, we've demonstrated something important tonight. True excellence isn't about exclusivity. It's about creating experiences that welcome everyone while maintaining the highest standards. Every chef here tonight, whether they work in a starred restaurant or a neighborhood favorite, brings something valuable to our city's culinary landscape." She gestured toward Emilio, who stood beaming beside his children. "And sometimes, the most authentic expressions of hospitality come from places that would never turn away a guest based on appearance." Laurent Bisset nodded solemnly, accepting the gentle rebuke with grace. The lesson had been learned, not through public shaming, but through positive example. As Elizabeth concluded her remarks, she introduced a surprise guest, the young boy whose life she had saved just before her encounter at Maison Laurent. His parents stood beside him, their eyes filled with tears of gratitude as they shared how the hospital's support programs had sustained them during their child's treatment. "This is why we're here," Elizabeth said simply. "Not because of a restaurant policy, but because when we come together, remarkable things happen." The evening continued well into the night, with boundaries dissolving between the servers and the served, between the famous and the unknown. Gene Hackman found himself deep in conversation with Emilio about their shared experiences of fatherhood, while Laurent Bisset took notes as Marco explained his grandmother's secret for perfect al dente pasta. As the event wound down, media coverage had already begun to circulate online. The story was no longer about denial of service, but about a response that had transformed negativity into a force for good. Commenters expressed admiration for Elizabeth's approach, not seeking revenge or public shaming, but creating something constructive that addressed a deeper need. 2 weeks later, Maison Laurent reopened with a new policy clearly stated on its website and at its entrance. All guests with reservations are welcomed with equal respect and hospitality. Marcel had chosen to resign, but Laurent had instituted a training program for his staff focused on recognizing unconscious bias. Elizabeth returned to her work at the hospital, still avoiding the spotlight, but now recognized not just as Gene Hackman's daughter, but as a force for change in her own right. The Breaking Bread event became an annual tradition, growing each year to include more restaurants and raise increasing funds for the hospital program. And Emilio's Deli saw its business flourish, not because of its newfound fame, but because it had always embodied the principle that Elizabeth had championed, that true hospitality meant welcoming everyone with the same warmth, dignity, and respect, regardless of appearance or status. In the end, what had shocked everyone wasn't a scandal or an outburst, but the power of responding to exclusion with inclusion, to judgment with understanding, and to rejection with community. It was a lesson that extended far beyond the restaurant industry, reminding people that sometimes the most powerful response to being shut out is to create a bigger, more welcoming table for all.